Welcome to ISOO's Derivative Classification Training. This briefing covers the minimum requirements outlined in Executive Order 13526 and 32 CFR 2001 and fulfills the requirements for mandatory derivative classification training. Agency personnel are welcome to use this briefing and add agency-specific requirements. My name is Peggy Ushman, and I am a Senior Program Analyst in Classification Management at the Information Security Oversight Office. With me today is one of our Program Analysts, Evan Corin, who also works in Classification Management and with the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel. Let's begin our discussion with identifying the differences between original classification and derivative classification. Original classification is the initial determination that information requires, in the interest of the national security, protection against unauthorized disclosure. Derivative classification is the incorporating, paraphrasing, restating, or generating in new form information that is already classified and marking the newly developed material consistent with the classification markings that apply to the source information. Original classification authorities, OCA, are required to have training every year. Derivative classifiers are required to have training every 2 years. We have 3 primary references that we use for derivative classification. Executive Order 13526, titled Classified National Security Information, prescribes a uniform system for classifying, safeguarding, declassifying national security information. 32 CFR Part 2001, also titled Classified National Security Information, is the implementing directive for the Executive Order, and our marking book provides additional marking guidance. All of these documents are available on the ISOO webpage at www.archives.gov/ISOO. The principles of derivative classification include avoiding overclassification, information sharing, classification levels, reasons for classification, duration of classification, prohibitions and limitations, classification challenges, identification and markings, security classification guides, and sanctions. Each one will be discussed throughout this presentation. The Reducing Overclassification Act was signed in October 2010 and is legislation designed to decrease overclassification and promote information sharing across the federal government and with state, local, tribal, and private sector entities. President Obama noted while signing this act that protecting national security information and demonstrating our commitment to open government through the proper application of classification standards are equally important and compatible priorities. The Reducing Overclassification Act takes concrete action to implement the lessons learned from 9/11, where the failure to share information prevented detection of the terror plot ahead of time. It does this by establishing procedures to promote information sharing with state, local, tribal, and private sector entities, and by providing training and incentives to promote accurate classification of information by federal employees. Simply put, overclassification occurs when information is incorrectly marked at the wrong level. For example, you mark a portion as top secret when it should be secret, or you mark a paragraph as secret when it should be unclassified, or you've marked the overall classification as top secret, but there is no top secret information in the document, or you've put incorrect dissemination and control markings on a document. Not only does this make the document difficult to use as a source document for other classification actions, it also makes the sharing of that information more difficult. Information sharing with other agencies and other governments has become an important factor in the way we do business today. Agency Inspector General offices are responsible for implementing this program. Before an individual can have access to classified information, there must first be a favorable determination of eligibility for access. The individual must sign an approved non-disclosure agreement. and the individual must have a need to know the information. Simply having a security clearance is not sufficient reason to have access to classified information. Our office used to be responsible for the Standard Form 312, but it was handed over to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence a few years ago. However, we still receive a lot of questions about it, so we put this notice on our webpage directing people to the appropriate place for any questions regarding the SF-312. The SF-312 is the non-disclosure agreement that is signed by everyone who has a security clearance. ODNI provided these guidelines. Previously executed SF-312s do not need to be re-signed simply because the form was updated, and electronic signatures are prohibited on the SF-312. This determination was made in response to a query made by ISOO to the Department of Justice. ODNI has not changed that policy. Any questions regarding this form should be directed to secea@dni.gov. In accordance with the executive order, there are 3 levels of classification: top secret, secret, and confidential. The criteria for assigning a classification level is dependent upon the level of damage that may be caused if this information is disclosed in an unauthorized manner. This determination is made by the original classification authority who has jurisdiction over the information. In order to understand derivative classification, you must first understand the basic principles of original classification, the initial determination that information requires protection in the interest of national security. Original classification authorities are designated by the President and in some cases further delegated by agency heads and senior agency officials. The OCA makes the determination that information be classified, why it is classified, and for how long it should remain classified. Section 1.4 of the Executive Order lists the reasons for which information may be classified. When making an original classification decision, the information must fall under one of these categories: military plans, weapon systems or operations, foreign government information, intelligence activities, intelligence sources or methods, or cryptology, foreign relations or foreign activities of the United States, scientific, technological, or economic matters relating to national security, safeguarding nuclear materials and facilities, vulnerabilities or capabilities of systems, installations, infrastructures, projects, plans, or protection services relating to the national security, and the development, production, or use of weapons of mass destruction. An original classification authority must establish an initial duration of classification not to exceed 25 years, and a derivative classifier cannot change that duration. A change in EO 13526 from previous executive orders is that this order specifically states that no information may remain classified indefinitely. Under no circumstances shall information be classified, continue to be classified, or fail to be declassified in order to conceal violations of law, inefficiency, or administrative error, prevent embarrassment to a person, organization, or agency, restrain competition, or prevent or delay the release of information that does not require protection in the interest of national security. In accordance with EO 13526, everyone is encouraged to question the classification of a document if they, in good faith, believe that the classification is incorrect. Classification challenges can be either informal or formal. An informal challenge is as easy as calling up the office that sent you the document and asking for clarification on the classification of a document. A formal challenge must be in writing. A strong classification challenge program in every agency is vital to the success of classification management. It is a system of checks and balances to maintain the integrity of the classification system. it is much better to challenge a classification using established guidelines than for something to be sent to the Washington Post because someone believed it shouldn't be classified and wanted to make a point. Agency heads and senior agency officials are required to establish procedures under which authorized holders of information are encouraged and expected to challenge the classification of information that they believe is improperly classified or unclassified while not being subject to retribution. The agency must establish and publicize the review process as well as appeal processes. An important distinction to make is that documents that are required to be submitted for pre-publication review or other administrative process pursuant to an approved non-disclosure agreement are not covered by this section, but are covered as a separate process. The implementing directive, 32 CFR Part 2001, reiterates the information from the order and adds information requiring agencies establish a system for processing, tracking, and recording formal classification challenges. Whenever an agency receives a classification challenge to information that has been the subject of a challenge within the past 2 years, or that is the subject of pending litigation, the agency is not required to process the challenge beyond informing the challenger of this fact and of the challenger's appeal rights, if any. The classification challenge provision is not intended to prevent an authorized holder from informally questioning the classification status of particular information. Such informal inquiries should be encouraged as a means of holding down the number of formal challenges and to ensure the integrity of the classification process. 32 CFR 2001 also lays out the timeline for initial responses and appeal submission. The agency has 60 days to provide an initial written response to the classification challenge. If they cannot provide a response within 60 days, the agency must acknowledge receipt of the challenge and provide a date by which the agency will respond. The agency must also advise the challenger that if no agency response is received within 120 days, the challenger has the right to appeal the challenge to the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, or ISCAP. So, why do we have to mark everything? Markings identify what information must be protected, the level of protection that is required, and who the classification authority is, why it's being classified, and how long the document must remain classified. As a side note, and as a good trivia question, portion marking was first mandated under EO 11652, signed in 1972 by President Nixon. Derivative classification is incorporating, paraphrasing, restating, or generating in new form information that has been previously classified. In other words, you are taking something from another document and using that same information in your new document. It is important to note that simply making a copy of a document is not derivative classification. Source documents for your derivative classification action includes other documents or security classification guides. There are 3 steps to be taken when derivatively classifying a document. After you have created your document, the first step is to apply portion marks to every portion: title, subject, paragraphs, bullet points, pictures, maps, photos, etc. The second step is to apply the overall classification marking. This will be the highest level of classification of any of your portion markings. The third step will be to apply the classification authority block. This block is usually placed at the bottom of the first page of the document and includes the name and position or personal identifier of the person who created the document, the source information where the information was derived from, and the declassification instruction, which is usually carried over from the source document. In this example, we have your source document to the left and your derivatively classified document to the right. We have taken a paragraph from the source document and copied it into our new memo. As you can see in this example, portion markings are carried forward with the section of the source document that is carried over into the derivative document. Again, all portions must be marked as shown in this example. Focusing now only on your derivatively classified document on the right, you must apply the overall classification of this memo. Based on the fact that the highest level of classification of any of the portions in the derivative document is secret, the overall classification of this document will be secret. This will be annotated at the top and bottom of the page and will be readily apparent. There is no requirement to use certain colors when annotating the overall classification. That is a holdover from the days when we used to stamp the classification on documents that were typed on a typewriter. Once your document is properly marked, you will apply the 3-line classification authority block. The classified by line will identify the person who created the document by name and position or personal identifier. If it is not readily apparent in the document, the agency should also be identified on this line. The derive from line in the derivative document shows where the information came from. The source document must be identified with enough information that it can be located if necessary. If you were using a security classification guide as your source document, you would identify the title of the guide, the office or organization it belongs to, and the specific location of the information in the guide. For example, Chapter 3, Item Number 7. Be as specific as you can to make it easier for someone to go back to the source document if they need to review it. The final step of the classification authority block is to identify the declassification instruction. If used in a single source document, the declassification date will be carried over to your new document. If using a security classification guide, the declassification date you will use will be annotated in the guide. For example, a lot of guides state declassify at 25 years. This means that you will add 25 years to the date that you created your document. For example, you create a document on March 22, 2017. You use a classification guide as your source document, and it states 25 years. You will add 25 years to 2017, making your declassification date March 22, 2042. To recap, when using a single source for your new derivatively classified document, be as specific as you can when annotating the derive from line and carry over the declassify on line as seen here in this example. Security classification guides can also be used as a source document for derivative classification decisions. Security classification guides are a record of original classification decisions made by an original classification authority. They must be approved and signed by the appropriate OCA who has ownership of that information. Most agencies that handle classified information have one or more OCAs that approve guides that fall under their purview. Guides must be reviewed and updated as necessary, but at least every 5 years. EO 13526 and 32 CFR 2001 have established a fundamental classification guidance review program whereby all classification guides go through an extensive review process every 5 years. We suggest to agencies that have a large number of guides to set up a review process so that 20% of their guides are reviewed each year. In this example, we have shown what the derive from line and declassify on line would look like when using a classification guide as your source document. Again, be as specific as possible when describing your source document. You don't always have just a single source for your document, so here we show how your document would be annotated if you're using more than one source document. The derive from line would be annotated multiple sources. However, there must be a list of those sources on or attached to your document, as shown in this example. This list should annotate the same information that would be placed in the derive from line for a single source. The fun part is determining the declassification instruction for your derivatively classified document. The rule is that the declassification instruction on your new document will be the most restrictive date from the source documents, the date that will keep the information classified for the longest period of time. This ensures that information will not be inadvertently released earlier than it should be. Now that we have covered how to appropriately apply a declassification instruction, let's cover declassification instructions that can no longer be used but may still appear on older documents. Some of you may remember using X1 through X8. These were exemptions from automatic declassification, but were eliminated under EO 12958 as amended in 2003. We now use 25X categories that will be discussed later, which extends the duration of classification another 25 years beyond the original 25 years determined by the OCA. OADR, Originating Agency Determination Required. This was an open-ended declassification instruction and allowed agencies to make declassification decisions when they determined it was best and not on a specific schedule. This was eliminated in 1995. MR, or manual review, was never a valid declassification instruction. It first appeared in the banner line, or the overall classification line, and indicated that there was information in the document that was not covered by EO 13526 and required a separate review process. A good example of this is restricted data and formerly restricted data, which fall under the Atomic Energy Act. Subject to treaty or international agreement is essentially the same as 25X9, which will be covered in more detail. For consistency, it is preferable to use the exemption code rather than a description of the exemption category. DNI only, or DCI only, refers to the fact that space-based imagery was in the document, and we will cover that on the next slide. 25X1 human has been changed to 50X1-HUME and is used for information that clearly and demonstrably could be expected to reveal the identity of a confidential human source or a human intelligence source. If you see X1 through X8, OADR, MR, or the phrase subject to treaty or international agreement on your source document, the general rule of thumb is to calculate a date that is 25 years from the date on the source document. This will become the declassification instruction on your new document. Otherwise, ignore any MR markings. Don't carry them over, don't agonize over them, simply ignore them. However, you should always check the appropriate security classification guide to ensure you have the latest classification information. If your source document contains DNI, Director of National Intelligence, or DCI, Director of Central Intelligence only, you should follow the instructions annotated in this attachment, which shows the classification authority block for both originally classified and derivatively classified documents. Space-based imagery belongs to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and the DNI has declassification authority over this information. I will now turn this over to Evan Coren.
Thank you, Peggy. 25X1 through 25X9 indicates the information is exempt from automatic declassification at 25 years. If any agency needs to keep information classified past 25 years, they must apply to the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, ISCAP, for approval. The agency OCA only has authority to classify information up to 25 years. When using an approved exemption, a date or independently verifiable event must be included with the marking and will not exceed 50 years from the date of the document. Detailed elements of information are approved for exemption by the ISCAP in the form of a declassification guide, and most of these are applied when the documents are 25 years old. A very limited number of these elements are approved to be used at document creation. It is extremely rare for an agency to have the authority to mark at creation a declassification date later than 25 years. When doing so, please confirm that authority has been granted for that specific piece of information. Simply put, the exemptions work like this. The OCA classifies information for the first 25 years. An ISCAP-approved 25X exemption keeps information classified for another 25 years, or 50 years total. There are also 50X exemptions, which will keep information classified for an additional 25 years beyond that, up to 75 years total. All exemptions other than 50X1 HUME and 50X2 WMD must be approved by ISCAP. The example here shows how it is properly annotated. The declassification line will show the appropriate 25X category, and a declassification date carries forward from the source document, or if classified off of classification guide, 50 years from the date of the document creation. If an original classification authority is classifying information that should clearly and demonstrably be expected to reveal the identity of a confidential human source or a human intelligence source, the duration shall be up to 75 years and shall be designated with the following marking, 50X1-HUME. If an original classification authority is classifying information that should clearly and demonstrably be expected to reveal key design concepts of weapons of mass destruction, the duration shall be up to 75 years and shall be designated with the following marking, 50X2-WMD. These are the only two exemptions that can be used on originally classified documents and do not require an associated date with the exemption category. These exemptions can be carried over to a derivatively classified document. This is the list of exemption categories. Agencies only get approval for much more detailed pieces of information, so use this only as a list of potential categories and consult the appropriate classification guide to determine if you have the authority to use one of these markings at initial classification. 25X1 covers confidential human sources, human intelligence sources, and relationships with the intelligence service of a foreign government or international organization. 25X2 covers development, production, or use of weapons of mass destruction. 25X3 covers cryptological systems. 25X4 covers state-of-the-art weapons technology. 25X5 covers formally named or numbered U.S. warplanes that remain in effect. 25X6 covers foreign relations. 25X7 covers protection of the president, vice president, or others. 25X8 covers vulnerabilities, and 25X9 covers instances where the unauthorized release of information would violate a statute, treaty, or international agreement that does not permit the automatic or unilateral declassification of information at 25 years. Classification by compilation is a determination that information is classified through the compilation of unclassified information. It is a derivative classification action based upon existing original classification guidance. If the compilation of unclassified information reveals a new aspect of information that meets the criteria for classification, it shall be referred to an original classification authority with jurisdiction over the information to make the original classification decision. Basically, it's unclassified information plus unclassified information that becomes classified information. When marking documents, each unclassified portion will be marked appropriately with a capital U in parentheses. The overall classification will reflect the classification of the compiled information, and a clear explanation will be provided on the document as to why the compilation of the unclassified information becomes classified. This slide shows an example of how a classification guide would be annotated with compilation information and how you would mark your document based on information from the guide. Earlier in 2017, based on feedback from agency personnel, we expanded the definition of classification by compilation to include information that is classified at a lower level that, when combined with other information, can become classified at a higher level. When marking a document, each portion will be marked with its appropriate classification. The overall classification will reflect the classification of the compiled information. A clear explanation will be provided on the document as to why the combination of the classified portions become classified at the higher level. This slide shows an example of how a classification guide would be annotated with compilation information and how you would mark your document based on the information from the guide. I will now turn this back over to Peggy.
Thank you, Evan. Okay, now we get into more specific marking examples. This example shows 3 different pages taken from the same report. As you can see, all the portions are appropriately marked. The title of the report, the headings, the bullet points, the paragraph, the chart, and the photo. Now we've added the overall classification markings. 32 CFR 2001.21b3 from the Implementing Directive states that each interior page of a classified document shall be marked at the top and bottom either with the highest level of classification of information contained on that page or with the highest overall classification of the document. The first page or cover will always be marked with the highest overall classification of the document. Here we have added the classification authority block, the classified by line, the derived from line, and the declassify on line. This is an example of a slide presentation and shows how the different slides would be marked. Slide 1 at the top is your cover slide. The title is portion marked, and the overall classification of the presentation as a whole is annotated at the top and bottom. The classification authority block is on this slide. Slide 2 shows an internal slide. It contains the appropriate portion markings and the overall classification. You have the option of marking the internal slides with the overall classification of the presentation or marking the overall classification of each individual slide. Slide 3 is also an internal slide that contains an embedded chart. The text on the slide is portion marked and the graph is portion marked. The graph also is marked as an independent object, so it contains the classification of the graph itself. One note, when adding graphs or charts to a presentation, be cognizant of the classification of the underlying data that is attached to the graph or chart. Word documents are marked the same way. Portion markings, overall classification, classification authority block on the first page. In this example, I want to demonstrate the options available for portion marking. This was a change with 32 CFR 2001 in 2010 and is meant to make portion marking slightly easier on the user. In the first paragraph example, it is implied that the subparagraphs are the same classification as the main paragraph, so you do not have to portion mark each subparagraph. In the other examples, at least one of the subparagraphs is a different classification from the main paragraph. When that occurs, every subparagraph must be appropriately portion marked as well as the main paragraph. If in doubt, portion mark everything. These are more examples of how to properly mark different things. The PowerPoint slide to the left shows portion markings of the title, bullet points and sub-bullet points, and the embedded picture. The title of the picture must also be portion marked. This slide also has the classification authority block. The beautiful cat photo shows the classification of the photo itself as well as the classification of the title of the photo. The slide containing the chart shows the appropriate portion marking, the overall classification, and the classification authority block. Portion marking can get difficult, but you cannot correctly determine the overall classification of a document without them. Keep in mind that while I have shown the classification authority block on 2 of the examples here, it is only required to be shown on the first slide of a presentation or the first page of a document. If you need to handle documents that contain sensitive compartmented information, or SCI, this is an example of how they are marked. They follow the same marking requirements as everything else we have covered. However, they also contain control and dissemination markings. Unless you work in intelligence, you may not need to worry about this, but if you see it, you should be able to recognize it for what it is. OD&I has responsibility for SCI markings. The intelligence community is required to follow the basic marking requirements outlined in EO 13526 and 32 CFR 2001, but they establish additional marking requirements for SCI specifically. Remember, if you are required to handle SCI material, you must be read into the applicable programs through your SSO. Restricted data belongs to the Department of Energy and includes data concerning design, manufacture, or utilization of atomic weapons, production of special nuclear material, or use of special nuclear material in the production of energy. Formally restricted data is classified information that is related primarily to the military utilization of nuclear weapons and belongs jointly to Energy and the Department of Defense. Transclassified Foreign Nuclear Information, or TIFNI, is classified information concerning foreign nuclear programs that has been removed from the restricted data category after DOE and the Director of National Intelligence have determined that it can be adequately protected in a manner similar to national security information in order to carry out the provisions of Section 102B of the National Security Act of 1947. The Department of Energy is still required to follow the basic marking requirements of the executive order and the implementing directive. However, they manage specific marking requirements for RD, FRD, and TIFNI. This guidance can be found in 10 CFR Part 1045. In order to receive or handle documents containing this type of data, a Q or L access is required. This slide emphasizes the classification and declassification authorities for RD, FRD, TIFNI, and NSI. DOE has sole responsibility for identifying and declassifying RD and declassifying TIFNI. DOE and DOD share responsibility for identifying and declassifying FRD. DOE and DNI share responsibility for identifying TIFNI. All executive branch agencies classify and declassify their own national security information, or NSI. To the extent possible, the commingling in the same document of RD or FRD with national security information classified under the order should be avoided. When it is not possible to avoid such commingling, the marking requirements in the order and the directive, as well as the marking requirements in 10 CFR Part 1045, nuclear classification and declassification, must be followed. For commingled documents, the Declassify Online shall not include a declassification date or event and shall instead be annotated with not applicable, or NA, to RD, FRD portions, and see source list for NSI portions. The source list, as described in 32 CFR 2001.22, shall include the declassification instruction for each of the source documents classified under the order and shall not appear on the front page of the document. This is an example of how an RD document may be marked. The important things to note: additional portion markings are used to indicate the RD-FRD portions. The declassification instruction must read, not applicable to RD or FRD portions, see source list for NSI portions. And each document containing RD or FRD must contain a warning statement as described on this slide. Again, you may not work with RD or FRD information, but it is good to recognize it if you should come across it. Unlike RD or FRD, a Q or L access is not required for TIFNI, but the individual must have a security clearance commensurate with the level of the TIFNI. They must have a need to know the information. TIFNI is stored, transmitted, and destroyed the same as NSI of the same level. Unlike FRD, it is treated the same as other NSI in foreign transmissions. TIFNI is never automatically declassified. If you have a document that may contain TIFNI, even if it has a declassification date or event, you must not declassify it, but instead refer it to the Department of Energy. This is an example of how a document containing TIFNI would be marked. Note the Declassify Online states not applicable to Tiffany portions. If you have specific questions about RD, FRD, or Tiffany, and your Information Security Office cannot answer them, please contact DOE. Emails seem to be one of the more difficult documents to properly mark, but once you break it down, it's really not that bad. Remember, the same rules apply: portion markings, overall classification, and classification authority block. This example shows your basic email and the appropriate portion marking. Here we have added the overall classification based on the portion markings. Just like with any other document, the overall classification goes at the top and bottom of the email. In this example, we have added the classification authority block. It's the same block used on all other documents and contains the classified by line, the derived from line, and the declassification instructions. There are times when your email is basically a transmittal document for a classified attachment. You are still required to portion mark the email because everything that resides on a classified system must be appropriately marked. But you should also include the statement, upon removal of attachment, this document is unclassified. Here's where we add the overall classification. In this case, because the email itself is unclassified, the overall classification is based on the classification of the attachment. Because the file name of the attachment doesn't readily identify the classification of the document, it is acceptable to indicate in the text of the email what the classification of the attachment is. And finally, we add the classification authority block. In this case, this is extra information that applies to the attachment. It is not absolutely required that you place this on the unclassified email, as it should be on the document itself. If this were a classified email with a classified attachment, then the overall classification would indicate the highest level of classification of either the text in the email or the attachment. What happens to the markings when you reply to this email but delete the classified attachment? The attachment has been removed, the original email retains its original markings, the reply is portion marked, and a new overall classification is annotated. Here is an example of an email thread where the original email is classified, but your response is unclassified. And this is where it starts to get confusing. But if you think of this as a stack of papers, it might be easier to understand. You can't change the markings on the earlier emails. So begin by focusing on your email. Appropriately portion mark your email and add the overall classification of your email only at the beginning and end of your email. Then you need to determine the overall classification of the entire email thread, which may or may not change depending on what you added to the thread. The overall classification is the classification of the package as a whole. So you need to review the thread to see what classified information remains in your response. For example, if you reply to an unclassified email that had a classified attachment, the attachment would drop off the package. Therefore, your new overall classification would be unclassified. However, if you forward the email and the classified attachment remains, then that would factor into the overall classification of the email as a whole. This is an example of an email thread with a classified reply to a classified email. Both the original email and the reply are marked as individual documents. The overall classification will indicate the overall classification of the email thread as a whole. If you add additional classified information to your response, then you must add a new classification authority block for the information you added. Now that we have finished with markings, let's talk about sanctions if you improperly release classified information. Employees are subject to the sanctions outlined in EO 13526 if they willfully, knowingly, or negligently disclose to unauthorized persons information properly classified under this order or predecessor orders, classify or continue the classification of information in violation of this order or any implementing directive, create or continue a special access program contrary to the requirements of this order, or contravene any other provision of this order or its implementing directives. Those sanctions may include reprimand, suspension without pay, removal, termination of classification authority, loss or denial of access to classified information, or other sanctions in accordance with applicable law and agency regulations. This is a screenshot of the Education and Training section of the ISOO webpage with our URL at the top. All of our policy documents, to include the applicable executive orders and implementing directives, can be found on the ISOO page at www.archives.gov/ISOO. Our marking book can be found on the Education and Training page, along with a number of training aids. And finally, here is the contact information for ISOO. Please feel free to contact us with any questions. Thank you.